Well, it seems like over the past decade or so, shows such as CSI and NCIS have really garnered a lot of interest, and for good reason. The state-of-the-art technology police use to solve crimes these days is fascinating, even mind-boggling. But let's go back a long, long time ago, before all that technology was a factor. How in the world did police solve cases back then? Well, we are happy to have historian Mike Dixon with us today to provide a little insight on that. Thank you for joining us, Mike.
Well, thanks for having me, Lisa.
All right, so we've really come a long way in crime solving, haven't we?
You figure before the arrival of the 20th century, police on Delmarva didn't have a lot to go with. At best, the sheriffs, the part-time constables, maybe your city police officers in Salisbury, you had a couple tools to work with, and those were witnesses and whatever little bit of physical evidence they could tease out of a crime scene. But there's nothing like the modern age that began to arrive in the top of the 20th century.
Yeah, and I mean, we were talking just before we went on air, even fingerprints weren't really a thing back then, or not something that they used to solve crimes.
It was not. We'll have turned the calendar to a new century, and around 1911, places, and these are urban places, at least like Chicago, they'll begin using fingerprints. And can you imagine? It's just like we're using DNA today, which is what brought this program about, actually. But can you imagine what a police officer thought that he could identify a person?
Oh, man, yeah. All right, so let's talk a little bit about prisons and punishment. They've also changed quite a bit.
Indeed, in many ways. So especially here in our region, for instance, the whipping post was certainly through the 19th century and remains on the books until the 1970s, the whipping post in Delaware. And it was a frequently used punishment. And the idea of incarcerating someone, that is modern. It comes in the 19th century, but incarcerating someone rather than physically punishing them was something that would evolve as we start into the 1800s.
That's interesting. Okay, so can you tell me what it was like when technology really started to change the way crimes were solved?
Many of our shocking cases right here on the peninsula will go unsolved for the lack of tools. Because, Lisa, if they didn't have a smoking gun, if they didn't have a witness or somebody, an informant giving them information, if they don't solve those crimes pretty soon, as the days tick by, these become cold cases instantly because you don't have communications. You don't have, somebody jumps on the train and heads out of town. There was a case in Wilmington that is it's an old cold case that is still very cold, where Wilmington officer Schultz was murdered around the midnight hour, and it's really bitter winter night. And they use all of the techniques they've got because it's 1891. But let's find somebody that knows something, round up the usual suspects, look for clues. There were no witnesses. And even to this day, that is a still unsolved cold case. And we'll talk about that when we have our program.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to ask you about. You have this talk. It's coming up next week?
It is coming up next week. The humanities group at Wesley College and the Parker Library on Wednesday evening at 6 p.m. Will host a talk called, a Delaware Humanities talk called CSI, the Historical Edition. And we're going to focus on the era before modern technology arrives, and we'll use a few of these cold cases and a couple that were solved, from poisoners and unsolved police officers to a couple of at least one serial killer case.
Sounds very interesting. Mike, why do you think people are so fascinated with crime solving, CSI, all this other stuff?
Yeah, so the program actually came about, Lisa, as police started using, as in California, like we were talking about earlier, began to use DNA to solve cases that had gone unsolved for 30-some years. And we're going to simply get closed out, just as that Wilmington police officer did. Well, people were interested. How did they do it before we had all of these modern tools? And I'll tell you, the other thing that helps is the interest, or creates the interest, are all of these crime programs. How many CSIs do we have on TV, right? And then when I'm doing the programs, people will often talk about these types of things.
Yeah, very interesting indeed. And we will have all the information on the talk on our website, delmarvalife.com. Historian Mike Dixon, thank you so much for joining us this Friday afternoon.
Thanks, Lisa. Thank you so much.